our first keynote speaker, Dr. David Fleet, who will be exploring the surprising effectiveness of diffusion models for generative imagery. Dr. Fleet is a Canada CFAR AI chair and a Vector faculty member, as well as a professor of computer science in the Department of Computer and Mathematical Sciences at U of T Scarborough. David also leads the Google Brain research team here in Toronto, which he joined in 2020. So David has been with the University of Toronto for about 20 years. Prior to that, he worked in the digital video analysis and perceptual document analysis groups at PARC for 4 years, and prior to that, he was on faculty at Queen's. David has served as area chair for numerous vision and learning conferences, and as associate editor in chief for the IEEE Transactions on Pattern Analysis and Machine Intelligence, for which he is now on the advisory board. David's research interests span computer vision, visual neuroscience, machine intelligence, and computational biology. His research awards include the 2010 Coenderink Prize, the Sloan Research Fellowship, and Best Paper Awards at ICCV, CVPR, and NeurIPS, to name a few. After David's presentation, we'll have approximately 5 minutes for questions. And for our online audience, at any point you have a question, just throw it in the chat. And for those of you in the room, we will be circulating a mic after the talk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Fleet.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be asked to come and speak here. I guess it is no surprise to everyone in this room that generative AI is receiving a lot of attention. That's obviously an understatement. In the context of images, a lot of that sort of widespread excitement is focused on probabilistic diffusion models, which is the topic of my talk today. And our first work on this, which was done with the Google Brain team here in Toronto, focused on the problem of single image super resolution. So you're given a low resolution image, and what you want to do is model the probability distribution over high resolution images that are consistent with that low resolution. And this is a challenge because for any given low resolution image, there may be many high resolution images that are consistent with it. In other words, the posterior probability distribution over high res images is multimodal. And that's even clearer when you start to look at other image-to-image translation tasks. So our next project, which we called Palette, was actually to build a multitask image-to-image translation system that worked on a variety of tasks. So shown here, for example, is the colorization task, where what we want to model and draw samples from is the posterior probability distribution over color images given a grayscale image. And what you can clearly see here is that random samples from the posterior distribution have very different colors, which sort of captures one of the key properties of diffusion models, which is their ability to model multiple modes, complex probability distributions. The other tasks we looked at with Palette were things like in-painting, where you want to infer the missing structure, for example, of the image you see on the left in the second row, or uncropping, where you're given part of an image and what you effectively want to do is expand the field of view. And the Palette model turned out to be the state-of-the-art on these tasks. We're also interested not just in conditional distributions where we condition on images, but other sources of information. And so our next project was to actually learn a class conditional generative model for various data sets. And one of the canonical data sets is the ImageNet classification data set, which we're using here, where what we showed was that you could condition on a class identifier, a number essentially between 1 and 1,000, and from that generate images which are representative of that class. Now, this is a problem that people had worked on in the past, but they could only get it to work well at low resolutions. What we did was took one of those earlier low resolution models, so it mapped a class ID into a small 32 by 32 or 64 by 64 image, and then we used our super resolution models to expand the resolution of the image up to what you see here. So how do diffusion models work? And I'm really just going to touch on this, but the idea is that they learn to transform a tractable distribution like the simple standard normal distribution you see depicted on the right side of the slide, and they transform that into complex multimodal distributions, and they do this via a sequence of distributions which are smoothed versions of the empirical data distribution on the left. And the idea is that with this, we can actually draw random samples from the data distribution. And the way we do this is we first draw a sample, for example, from the standard normal on the right, and then to draw a sample from the next distribution moving right to left, we use that first sample as an initial guess, and then we use a neural network to adjust that initial guess to ensure that it's a fair sample from the marginal distribution at that stage. And you could do this periodically, and eventually, when you go through the sequence of distributions, you get a fair sample from the empirical data distribution you really want. Now, with images, we do this, the way we create these smooth distributions for images is we simply add noise. And the more noise you add to an image, the smoother the distribution over images become. And the key step to these diffusion models that we have to learn is the incremental removal of noise, which is essentially that adjustment by the neural net at each step of what we call the reverse process as we gradually transition from noise back to the original image. And this is simply a neural network that is trained to take a noisy image as input, and what it gives us back is a slightly less noisy image. And if we apply that repeatedly, we go all the way from noise back to the original image. Now, everything I'm going to talk about today are actually conditional diffusion models. So the input to this neural network that does the denoising is not only the noisy image, but also some conditioning signal. So it could be a class ID, for example, for the class conditional models, or it could be a low resolution image or a grayscale image that we want to convert into color images. And that leads us to the Imagine model, which was a large-scale text-to-image model. And to be honest, really all we did with the Imagine model was we took our class conditional models, which I talked to you about earlier, and instead of conditioning a class identifier, we now condition on a set of contextualized text token embeddings. And so the model is a cascade of 4 stages. The first stage takes the text prompt and gives us contextualized embeddings. The second stage is our base model that takes, conditioned on the textualized embeddings, gives us a low resolution image, and that's followed by 2 super resolution models. And that's what the Imagine system was. Now, there was a lot of work that went into it, and there was a lot of work and compute needed to train it, but it was an incredibly exciting project. This is one of the very early images we had that we had a lot of fun with. But to be honest, what made this project super exciting for us was when we put it in the hands of artists at Google. And the artists started to work miracles with it that were beyond our imagination, really. And it was just so much fun to see what artists like Irina Block were able to do with the model. And one fascinating part about the model is the incredible fidelity of image structure you get at very high resolution. So in this case, we're generating a 4,000 by 4,000 pixel image, and you see all sorts of detailed properties when you really zoom into it. Okay, all that said, historically, the point of generative models was not to generate really cool images. To be honest, back in the day, 25 years ago, when I started working on this, we were not thinking that far ahead. What we wanted to do was try and learn models of the visual world to support image understanding. And given the emergent properties of large language models that we see today, providing all sorts of abilities on a myriad downstream tasks that they were not trained on, it's natural to ask, are these diffusion models for images somewhat similar in their ability to support a wide range of downstream tasks for which they were not necessarily trained? And what I wanted to do today is really take you, or go off the beaten path a little bit of just generating fantastic images and look at some of the different tasks that we have tried to apply these models to get a feeling for how agile, how powerful they might really be. And I'm going to talk about 3 pieces of work, all of which are unpublished today, but hopefully will be soon. So the first is the problem of generative data augmentation. So one of the sort of holy grails, the aspirational goals of generative models, going right back to the very beginning, was, could we learn a generative model that could sample data that was sufficiently representative of the empirical data distribution that we could actually then use those samples as data for training models to do other tasks, discriminative tasks, like learning to classify images. And this has been a very elusive goal, and to date, we haven't really reached that milestone. And the canonical example that we started looking at was the ImageNet classification problem. And this is a great acid test for generative models, because the problem has been so well studied for years and years and years. And now we got hints that this might be possible with our cascaded diffusion model for ImageNet, which I showed you earlier. And so we wondered, if we were to take a more powerful model like the Imagine model and fine-tune that on the ImageNet training set, could we really even learn a much, much better class conditional ImageNet model? Now you might wonder, why would you even need to fine-tune it? You could just use the class names as prompts for the text-to-image model. And the problem is that there are various classes within ImageNet which are actually not necessarily unique. They're somewhat ambiguous. So, for example, a word like bank could be a financial institution. It could also be a riverbank. And a lot of the ImageNet classes had class names that were somewhat ambiguous. And so the images, what I'm showing here, the images on the left were just drawn from the raw Imagine model using the class names as prompts. And after fine-tuning, the images we get back for the same prompts are shown on the right, which are much more coherent and from these classes. And it turns out that this fine-tuned model is now the state-of-the-art, using the standard metrics of success like FID and inception score, things that are used to quantify the quality of a generative model. But what we were really interested in is how well they can be used for downstream tasks like learning classifiers. And the key metric for this is something called the classification accuracy score. What you do with a classification accuracy score is you generate a whole bunch of data from your generative model, the same number of images that are in the ImageNet training set. You train a model solely on synthetic data, but then you test it on the real ImageNet test set. And this has been done in the past with VAE, variational autoencoders, and generative adversarial networks, et cetera, and with very limited success. Our cascaded, the baseline performance is this dashed line at the top, which is the accuracy of the same architecture, same training procedure, but trained on real data. So that's our target. And the middle data point here was our cascaded diffusion model, and with the fine-tuned Imagine model, we've really narrowed that gap to our baseline model trained on real data. Now, it's actually interesting to look at the individual classification accuracies for each class. So on this plot, what it shows is each blue dot is the classification accuracy for one of 1,000 models along the x-axis. And all those red dots are the corresponding classification accuracy for a model trained on data which came from our cascaded diffusion model. And although the accuracies are pretty good, they're generally below the model trained on real data. And here's what we get with our fine-tuned Imagine model. All of a sudden, for many classes, the model trained on synthetic data is actually better than the model trained on real data. But what was really important to us was to say, can we augment real data with synthetic data and do even better than the state of the art? And so what we took, we took a dozen different architectures, convolutional neural networks, transformer-based models, and for all of them, we took real data, we added synthetic data to that real data, and for every one of them, which at one time or another was a state-of-the-art, we were able to boost performance above the state-of-the-art baseline performance of those models. And so this is, I think, a real milestone for generative models. The second problem that I wanted to talk to you about is a somewhat different problem. Say you didn't have enough data to fine-tune the Imagine model. Could you still use it as a zero-shot learner where you're given an image and a set of categories, and you have to decide, is that image, which category should I use to classify that image? And there was a really neat piece of work by Priyank Jaini and Kevin Clark on my team at Google for how to do this. And here was the idea they had. Suppose you take the image you want to classify, and then you add noise to it, and then you go to denoise it, but you're going to denoise it using one of the class labels as the prompt. So you might say, okay, denoise that using the conditional prompt, an image of a bird, for example. And you get an image that looks a little like the one you started with, but a little more like the bird. Or you might say an image of a cat or an image of an elephant. And you can do that for all the classes. And then what you do is essentially pick the image, you choose the label that generated the images which maximizes a variational lower bound. Or effectively, you choose the label for which the generated image is closest to the noisy image that you started with. And it turned out that that classifier worked extremely well, outperforming the predominant contrastively learned text-image models like CLIP that were out there in the literature, which was a huge surprise to us. But there was an even bigger surprise, which is that the model seemed to align extremely well with human perception. Now, it's actually well known that there are a lot of differences between human perception and computer neural net-based classifiers. And one of those differences relates to the cues, the visual cues they use to classify images. So for example, if I show you these two images here, the texture on the left and the object in the center, both, if asked, given the right set of categories, both a neural network and a human will both identify the texture on the left as an elephant and the object in the center as a cat. But what if I mix those two and I give you something that appears to have the shape of a cat but with the texture of the elephant? Here, humans will generally say that's a cat, and a neural network will generally say that's an elephant. And what we found with Imagine was that Imagine agreed with people. It would say that's a cat. And that was really interesting to us. In fact, more generally, what Priyank and Kevin and another colleague of theirs, Robert Geierhaus, did was they took 17 different out-of-distribution data sets that were distorted in different ways, line drawings, Q conflict data sets like this one, and they showed that Imagine for the first time gave the sort of accuracy which was human-like in its robustness across these different data sets. And another question you can ask is, do different models actually make the same mistakes? So for this plot shows the pairwise similarity of the errors made by different models. And the more saturated the color, the more similar they are. So in the top left, we have about 60 different discriminatively trained models. These are ConvNets, transformer-based models, contrastively learned models, etc. And they all essentially agree, they make the same errors on these out-of-distribution data. In the bottom right, I have 10 subjects, human subjects, and they all agree within their group on the errors they make, but the errors are quite different from the neural networks. The remaining 2 rows and columns in this display, this array, are for 2 generatively trained models, one based on Imagine, one based on Stable Diffusion, and they largely agree with human observers. So this also was something that we found quite stunning. Anyway, I think I'm probably running out of time. So I have one more piece of work that I wanted to talk to you about, which asks the question whether these large-scale diffusion models learn enough structure of the visual world to support a wide variety of other computer vision tasks. And in particular, we were interested in dense tasks, where for every pixel you wanted to infer something about the structure of the world or the image. And that could be segmentation, like semantic segmentation, where at every pixel you want to know what object is there, what type of object. It could be depth estimation, where at every pixel you want to know how far the object is from the camera, or it could be motion, where you want for every pixel to know what the motion was like between 2 frames in video. And so, these tasks were interesting for 2 or 3 different reasons. The first is that models like Palette that I talked about earlier are all totally self-supervised. So you don't need any annotated images to train those models, and yet they learn a tremendous amount about the structure of the visual world. And so one issue is, can we leverage models like Palette as pre-trained models to then solve these tasks? The second issue is, for many of these tasks, it's extremely hard to get good annotated data labeled by people, pixel by pixel, what's going on in the image. We also wanted to know whether we could use large amounts of synthetic data to train these models. And the final issue for us was that most of the available data that is out there for training these models is very noisy and incomplete, which in and of itself was a real challenge for training diffusion models. So the project involved 2 tasks. The first is basically the depth inference task. We want to learn a posterior probability distribution over depth maps given a single image. And in the second task, we wanted to learn the probability distribution over the optical flow field, or the motion vector field, given 2 images, frame 1 and frame 2 of video. What's interesting about both these problems is they've both been studied for a long time. In the case of optical flow, it's what I did my PhD work on. I don't know how long ago it was, but I guess it was 30 years ago. And what we've found to date is that the models that do well on these tasks in the computer vision literature are very, very highly specialized models, very specialized architectures, training procedures, etc. What we wanted to know with diffusion models was, could we learn a single model, a single architecture, a single style of recipe for training, a single loss function that works across all these tasks? And so, for example, in this case, what we would be doing is we're learning a denoiser. In this case, we're learning to actually produce a depth map or an optical flow map rather than a natural image. And instead, the natural image becomes the conditioning signal for the network. So in this case, our conditioning signal is the real image, and what we're trying to do is generate a sample from the probability distribution over depth maps or optical flow fields. And what we found is that these models are incredibly good and unheard of in the field of optical flow analysis. These models improved performance by 25% over the previous state-of-the-art, which was somewhat unheard of recently and horrifying to me because it meant most of what I did in my PhD was not necessarily particularly relevant anymore because these models are just so generic in the way that they perform. What I'm doing here is just zooming in on a part of the scene. You can see this is just, I'm showing on the very left one of the two frames zoomed in. In the middle, I'm showing the previous state-of-the-art, the so-called raft model. And what I'm showing on the right is a little segment of the flow field visualized in color from our new method. And we got very, very similar results across depth as well. One of the interesting properties about these models is that because they capture multiple modes of the posterior distribution, they're actually good at representing ambiguity in a Monte Carlo sense wherever you have plausible uncertainty or ambiguity in the image. For example, should the shadow that the car casts on the ground move with the car, or should it be stationary? Or if you look at the window of a car as it's moving, should it move with the car or should it move with the reflection of the light in the window? And what we found is that different samples represent these different interpretations of the scene. Something that previous optical flow methods had not been capable of. And we found the same kinds of patterns of behavior in our depth model. One final thing we did, I'll sort of end with this, one final thing we did was we combined a bunch of the models that I've already talked about to do something like 3D or text to 3D. So we took our text image model to generate an image. And then from that image, we generate a depth map. So now at every pixel, I have the color and the depth of the point. So I know where it is in the world and I know what color it is. And then with respect to that 3D point cloud, you can move the camera and reproject the points back to the image. And then we can use, actually it's a model I haven't talked about, which is called Imaginator or the Imagine Editor, which actually will take parts of an image and use the text guidance to fill in the missing parts of the image. And then we use the imputation properties of our depth network to fill in the missing depths. And with that, what we're able to do is go all the way from text to 3D worlds. And so we're combining this text-to-image model, the depth estimator, the text-guided image completion algorithm, effectively in-painting, and then the depth imputation properties. And you get something that looks like this from a prompt, which was just a living room. Okay, so I'm going to conclude. I don't have a lot to say in conclusion other than I think these models are shown to be much, much more powerful than simply able to generate cool-looking pictures. And to me, as a researcher, that's really an intriguing it's an intriguing result. And I've sort of tried to make that argument with 3 different examples of recent work that we've been doing with my team at Google. Now, again, just to hammer this home, lest you believe any of this work is actually what I do, let me just say that these are the individuals, these are the 15 people that were involved in all these projects and contributed the vast majority of the ideas and the hard work to make it all happen. And so thanks go to them. And with that, let me conclude.